Thank you for coming to the panel. Today we'll be talking about governance with Vlad, Gavin, and Arthur. So Vlad is working at the Ethereum Foundation, Gav is working on Polkadot, and Arthur is working on Tezos. And we'll be discussing on-chain governance, risk, and rewards. If you guys want to quickly introduce yourself, that'd be great. Starting with you, Vlad.
Hey, I'm Vlad Zamfir. I'm a researcher, and I'm going to be taking the against on-chain governance approach, but I'm happy to talk about pros anyways. Few though they may be.
My name's Gavin. I did some stuff with Ethereum, and now I'm doing some stuff with Polkadot and Parity and stuff.
My name is Arthur. I'm working on Tezos, a project which is often associated with on-chain governance.
Cool. So maybe let's start very simply. Like, how would you define governance? What is governance?
Okay, so I would say that given a economic system, governance is the means by which the economic system avoids, retains its cohesion, and while moving forward with potential alterations or changes in its external environment. So a governance system that is broken will mean that that economic system falls apart, disintegrates, splits, and has a schism. And otherwise, it's the thing that's in place in order to prevent that from happening in a changing environment.
I would mostly agree. I would say that governance is a set of rules that dictate how commons should be used. And I say commons as opposed to something like private property. And so in private property, you use it as you see fit, and it's yours, and there's no conflict. But if you have to share a property with someone, now you need some rules in how you're going to access it.
Well, I mean, I think governance includes these things. It includes decisions and decision-making processes, and how we might adapt, make changes to the protocol due to changes in the environment. But I think it's mostly about the way that we coordinate around decisions and decision-making processes, and specifically how we legitimize and delegitimize and engage in the the politics by which we establish and revoke our norms and processes. I think mostly about coordination between people and not about rules or decisions.
Cool. Okay, so now you have a rough idea what these people think is governance. And then maybe to jump into the next point, it's why do we need governance? What is actually the key fundamental problem that we're trying to solve with governance, right? Bitcoin has been around and it doesn't have any sort of formalized governance system. So why do we need governance in these new projects? Or in the case of Ethereum, it's try to bolt on governance after the fact.
Because we're trying to do some crazy shit. And it's really, really very ambitious. And if we don't govern our efforts, then what's going to happen is we might have unintended consequences that we're going to regret.
Yeah, I think Bitcoin's a pretty decent example. So with Bitcoin, the governance process is essentially status quo. Yeah, it's kind of like the null decision. Let's avoid making decisions. And the issue is that in a changing environment, and Bitcoin exists, there can be both internal and external factors that change, but Bitcoin exists in a time of very changing technology. A lot of development has happened since Bitcoin was launched in this space. And if the processes that keep Bitcoin together don't adapt to those changing environments, then you will find that the thing that we call Bitcoin splits into lots of things, all sort of half called Bitcoin. It will find it difficult to retain its cohesion. I mean, this is kind of the same thing that happened in the Catholic Church, right? With the schisms in when was it, 600, 500 AD? But in principle, the governance processes failed, and it split into multiple different leaderships. And if there isn't a way of resolving those leadership differences in the face of changing circumstances, then that's what will happen.
So I think in general, whenever you have conflicts, the best way to organize things is private property whenever it's possible, because it's scalable and decentralized. However, there are some things that you cannot easily share. And so, for example, in the space of cryptocurrencies, you have the type of algorithm that you use, the type of rules that you're going to have around transaction validation. All of this stuff is shared, and since you have to live with shared parts, you have to live with the other people who are using your ledger, you need some governance rules around that. And I think that everyone has governance, including Bitcoin. The question is, are your governance rules explicit or implicit?
Yeah, and are they legitimate or not? You know, and what are you doing to maintain legitimacy? And what happens when there's a crisis? How do you deal with new issues that come up that there's not a process for? You know, there's a governance is hard to define because there's always more questions.
So governance creates more questions than answers, maybe. Well,
It
so
has to do with like this big context, this broader context of all of the people involved, and it's not just merely a technical question. And this is, I think, like one of the reasons why I think Bitcoin governance was so difficult is because they were trying to address the block size issues through technical debate, even though that wasn't really the nature or source of the the divergent interest that people have in smaller and bigger blocks.
I think the legitimacy question is really interesting, and that might be that. So when I think of governance and these systems, I don't necessarily think of legitimacy, but that's mostly because I don't think that governance can be a source of legitimacy. And by that I mean, you know, if you have a lot of people using a system and they consent to using the system, then whatever role the system is going to use is legitimate by definition. And if the people do not consent to use the system, it does not matter what type of rule you're going to have, you're not going to have any legitimacy to begin with.
But with network effects, you don't really get to choose. You know, you don't get to choose that much. You have a small number of choices, you know, so you're like somewhat coerced just by network effects. Like, do you get to choose Twitter and Facebook? I mean, I guess you could use Peepit.
So this seems like this seems like an argument of using a governance process as a way of kind of generally moving beyond the specific system that you're meant to govern and just generally try to enforce a particular opinion about the world.
I mean, I wouldn't call it enforcing an opinion. I think of it more as like, you know, having the systems that we use like respond to our needs as opposed to being something that we treat as an end in themselves.
Yeah, so I'd agree that a governance system needs to respond to the needs of its users, but I don't think it should respond to the needs of other systems' users.
I mean, yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, totally. I mean, it would be great if like the Ethereum blockchain did what was good for the Ethereum community and not for like what's good for like some other
everyone else,
you know,
Bitcoin.
Yeah,
for example.
We're all thinking it.
Yes. Actually, I want to pick up back on sort of what you mentioned with the Bitcoin upgrades, right? So there are two separate things to governance. So we had some governance problems in Ethereum around altering state. And then we have the other type of governance upgrade. So like, how do you upgrade the core protocol? What are your thoughts on, should we govern one but not the other, or should we govern both? Or by default, we just have to end up governing both?
So I would say that the definition of governance covers anything that is that the system itself can't otherwise do autonomously. So Ethereum, for example, can autonomously allow smart contracts to be created. Those smart contracts can destruct themselves if they want. That governance doesn't really cover that, or need not cover that. But governance is what happens beyond that. It's kind of the thing that you would expect a leader to have to step in and manage under normal circumstances. And in systems that don't have a leader, then I would say the governance process is the process by which we make those decisions in lieu of a leader.
So the governance process of the meta leader.
I would restrict it a little more. I like the idea of saying that governance is what you cannot fix using the platform itself. But I would go further. I would say you should not use governance for something that could have been avoided by the use of the platform itself. So I mean, I do worry about governance introducing attack vectors in the system. And the way that you prevent against that is to try and limit it as much as possible. But that's actually technically difficult to do because there's a very the separation between what is a core system and what is the content, or like the separation between the code and the data, is actually is really hard to pinpoint. It feels intuitively clear, but to define in code is very hard. But it's something I think we should be striving to.
So I think it feels intuitively clear subjectively. So like I know what is good, but it might not be a different definition to what you think is good. So I also think that if you restrict governance to the things that you literally could not have done without, could never have done without, then you kind of remove all of the... So for example, suppose I have an upgrade to a system that just facilitates some particular thing, optimizes something. It doesn't make anything possible, anything new that's possible. Does that mean it shouldn't fall under this this definition of governance?
Well, I think if you have something like this, so I tend to think that, and I tend to think that there are a few trade-offs in the design of blockchains, but it doesn't mean that they don't. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. It means that typically they're minor and they're small enough that one solution can generally be seen as better than another solution. I think even if you have something like something that doesn't make anything possible, there will still be some small trade-offs, and you still want to clear that with a governance mechanism that's going to be able to say, yes, we've seen this, and it's clear that the trade-offs are small enough.
So I think if you have a governance mechanism that is fundamentally and uniquely meritocratic or technocratic, then that might be possible. But I think the whole point of a governance system is if you don't have a purely technocratic authority to fall back on, then it's sort of the next best thing, and I guess in some sense it should be responsible to the allotted stakeholders of the system. That I guess is a whole other thing.
All stakeholders of the system,
yeah, well.
all of them, even the ones that don't speak out and try to represent themselves.
But the issue is that if you try and limit it to like strict upgrades, then I suspect you'll eventually sort of find yourself in a debate about whether something is a strict upgrade, with the classic example being Bitcoin trying to double its block size. Now, some people would argue that is a strict upgrade. Others would argue that it's philosophically problematic and it would lead to technical deficiencies. And that there isn't anything that is strictly
They all
an
kind of
upgrade.
reject the idea that they're going to decide based on social considerations, right? Like Bitcoiners really believe that social considerations in government is wrong and only opens them up to attack. And I think that the security of governance and the question of whether we should do socially motivated upgrades are super linked, because they're somewhat much more arbitrary, and we don't all agree that it's necessary. We all kind of agree that tech governance is necessary because it's very real, very really necessary. When there's critical bugs and things break, you need that tech governance. But the socially motivated governance people don't really agree about, and they think of it as a vulnerability. And I think if Bitcoiners had thought of the block size as a socially motivated governance problem, story looks quite different, right? There's the groups of people who are disenfranchised by or who are upset by the small block decision. Very different kind of socioeconomic class in Bitcoin than the people who really want the small blocks.
So you mean literally a difference between rich and poor Bitcoin users?
No, between users who have an interest in big blocks and users who have an interest in small blocks.
Okay, so how is that socially motivated?
Well, because there's the people in the Bitcoin community, stakeholders who are affected by governance decisions, are affected by them in different ways. And they don't agree because they don't perceive that they benefit. Not because of technical considerations.
So do you mean miners and non-miners?
Or
large miners and small miners?
No, I mean payment processors versus decentralization maximals.
So you just mean winners and losers. There's a decision
Winners
to
and
be made
losers,
over
yeah,
winners
exactly,
and
yeah, exactly, yeah. And I think that the framing it as a tech debate is wasn't super healthy, because it kind of made the losers visible, or make them go to Bitcoin Cash where they're not even Bitcoiners anymore.
Yeah, okay, so I guess if you take the software upgrade, governance should be just about software upgrades, then basically you're saying there should be no losers. That's pretty much the definition of that. Right?
Well, so
the tech decides who the winners and losers are. It's not us.
Yeah.
It's not us.
It's the people who
It
deploy
wasn't
Someone
that
else has
that
to
decide, isn't it?
So I do think there is one trade-off that exists in this space, and there's a decentralization throughput trade-off for some wide definition of throughput and some wide definition of decentralization. And I don't think the systems that exist are anywhere near the efficient frontier, but definitely a doubling of the block size in Bitcoin, was representing a trade-off. And there were scaling solutions for Bitcoin, like Bitcoin NG, which did not involve making this type of trade-off, but they were not being considered because they were just like too far from the original design. So yeah, this type of questions will happen, and these are questions where there are winners and losers. But I think one of the main different class of users in Bitcoin, and let me backtrack. For me, the block size debate was primarily about large miners versus small miners. I mean, the difference is that if your block starts getting larger, then the time to propagate them becomes longer, and it means that large miners have a superlinear advantage in creating blocks. So for me, that's the main thing. It's not like, oh, I have only a laptop, I can't download a 2 megabyte block. That's not what it is. It creates a concentration of the mining power. And moving to a system which are proof of stake, at least you still have differences of interest between the validators of your system and the users of your system. And I know you're going to fight me on users, but it's still overall a lot better aligned that you would have in a proof of work system where you really have two very, very different class of participants in the system.
Right. Maybe to circle back a little bit, I also want to talk about what is your perspective on, besides purely software upgrades, what is your perspective on should governance be allowed to sort of like change account balances or fix obvious bugs that caused, should governance be allowed to alter state?
Well, so let me rephrase the question slightly, because governance is technically capable of doing it. The question is whether there should be a governance process that has the legitimacy so that it has the authority to make these decisions. Should there be a process with the authority to change balances? I think that's really the question. But I think definitely governance can do it. I personally think there should be a process that has the authority to do it, but I don't think it should be a process that is let me put it this way. I don't have any clear ideas as to exactly what that process is.
So, I think there is a process, by definition there is a process that can do it. Unfortunately, it requires literally everybody who recognizes this particular blockchain to implement those rules, right?
Yeah.
So that process exists. I guess the question is, should there be, what's the minority protection of the process?
No, or how do we make it so that, with EAPs, we don't need to, hawkishly watch all of them to make sure that, nothing weird goes through? We have to have a process that, is legitimate for dealing with it so that we don't need to, actively participate in a heated political conversation every time there's any state change.
The price of freedom is constant vigilance.
I hear you.
Actually,
So I think that also maybe it's ultimately there are clearly some level of state change that you don't want to give your governance. I think you should prevent your governance from just having arbitrary pseudo-power on all of the balances. And you should do that programmatically, rather than saying, let's all agree, let's have this really strong social consensus that we're not going to do that. I think it's better if you have a way of introspecting into governance proposal and making sure that they don't affect state. Now, formalizing that is really hard. So there are ways, for example, of saying, let's not increase the number of tokens. That's really doable. Saying, we're not going to change states. That's tougher, but I think it's ultimately doable. I think you can ultimately write clear, well-defined predicates that say no state, no state change, just code change. That's possible.
But you can never escape the off-chain hard fork upgrade.
No, of course not. Of course not. And so you can do that. I don't think it's the optimal. I don't think it's necessarily the optimal level of where to put the bar. But if you were to put the bar towards a decision of more states change, it's really hard. So one rule which I like from a moral ethical perspective that I like is the idea of let's say that you have funds. If the funds have not changed hands, you're not threatening the fungibility of the system, or like you're not threatening anyone's ability to accept funds if they have not changed hands. So I think that's like from an ethical perspective, that's probably a better rule, but it's a lot harder to implement than a simpler rule of saying no state change. So it's probably from a pragmatics perspective what governance system should aim for.
Yeah, so I think I wholeheartedly disagree with that sentiment. I would say that the whole point of having governance is in order to do precisely these unexpected state changes. I think there is really no way of trying to put some sort of enforced economic stability through governance in a general purpose system like a smart contract system like Ethereum or whatever, simply because you don't know what any particular value in storage might encode or might not encode. It's potentially, I guess, in a fixed function system like Bitcoin, it might be possible. So if you're going to restrict your chain to purely non-scripted payments, maybe it becomes possible then. But then it's like harder to see where why you would ever, how you could ever change it in order to make it, in order to add new functionality that didn't make it not just a fixed function payment chain. But that aside, I don't think governance should be restricted in that way. In the same way that a CEO of a company, if they have the board's backing, shouldn't be restricted to operating in some particular region or some particular market. It should be possible for them, or having some particular structure by which they govern their company. I think it should be possible for them to implement the plans that they have if they have the backing of the shareholders.
And I agree that it's hard. And even in Bitcoin's case, it's hard. There's this tendency to believe that in Bitcoin, with a soft fork, you're not going to affect balances and so on and so forth. But it's very easy to do a soft fork which says you will lose all your Bitcoin if you don't send me half of them within the next 2 hours. That's a soft fork in Bitcoin, and so you can do this stuff. You can do these sort of things. It's really hard to avoid state changes, but I think you can limit them. You can at least limit them towards making the upgrades really look ridiculous if it's trying to do a state change.
But even if you limit them programmatically, like unless you have like the social norm that is something we respect, we can always like make changes to the software repo as long as it's possible to do the surgery. I mean, like with the DAO hard fork, for example, it was possible to like move all the balances at this height. And with sometimes, in some cases, it's possible to write the code that will like do the intervention, and sometimes it's more challenging. But if it's possible to do the governance intervention, then and there's no social norm to stop it, and the costs of doing the upgrade are low enough relative to like our motivation to do it, like we can. There's nothing that's stopping us. And so in some way, the question is like, should we have norms and beliefs that stop us from governing beyond the inconvenience of doing these tech upgrades? And the answer that like most of the capture fatalists have, people who believe that the blockchain is like definitely going to get captured, is like, no, we should never make any. We should have strong norms against making changes because that will protect us from being captured.
Okay. Maybe this is actually now a good time to move on to sort of talking about minority protections. So, in like a common concern really with governance is how do you protect the minorities? Like what prevents governance from passing upgrades that sort of remove the bottom 1% or the bottom 10% balances? And so what are your thoughts on sort of like how do you protect minorities and how do you structure governance processes that actually do provide those protections?
So firstly, any chain that allowed 90% to remove 10%'s balances wouldn't last very long as any kind of store of value. So I think kind of self-preservation in part would look after that. But beyond that, I think some degree of a required, like some degree of forced long-term outlook onto any alterations from the original rule set are probably a sensible thing to bring into the governance mechanism. For example, suppose the 90% did vote to push through a referendum to remove 10% assets. In that case, the 90%, before that's actually enacted, but after it's been decided that it would be enacted, the 90% cannot interact with their assets, but the 10% can. So the 10% get to sell up and move out as a sort of protection. The 90%, the ones that actually, the majority who carried it through, are then left with their assets being locked as the chain now devalues because A, 10% have just sold up, and B, everyone's looking forward to a chain where now 90% are maliciously acting against it.
No, I completely agree. I mean, the main difference is that with other systems, that these cryptocurrencies have value because of the goodwill, because of there's an entire community that recognize that they have value. It's a very circular thing, and so if you start acting maliciously, you're basically ruling over symmetry. So there's really no point in doing that. And also, yeah, delays are good in general. Like in any governance system, if you build in delays, first of all, you leave people the time to hard fork out of a stupid decisions, which are always possible, and also people can coordinate against the governance decision, because in general, if the governance decision is good, people won't need to coordinate against it. But if it's bad, you want to leave people in and out.
I think it really, really shouldn't be understated how really incredibly difficult it is to make sure that minorities are represented, especially when we're talking about people who aren't participating in governance and who aren't actually like at the table participating in the discussions at the relevant times. And I think that there's like another big problem that we have in this conversation is that like we have like assumptions about the idea that we can measure stakeholders, and then we have some notion of like who 90% are and how much of a percentage of the community does this stakeholder group make up. And I think that's like really kind of problematic because I don't think that we can come to consensus on what these weights are, and I don't think that we can come to consensus on what those weights are in a way that doesn't disenfranchise loads of people. Because I think like there's lots of stakeholder groups, and like not all of them are going to be active, and it's not always going to be clear to us what their interests are, and it's really going to be challenging, to represent everyone's interests. And I don't think that like any voting system, unless you manage to give everyone a vote and you make it like unanimous, that you have any like guarantee that everyone is going to be represented. So like I think like there will be losers, and then we need to have like a culture that cares about all the stakeholders.
I mean, so like removing 10% balances is sort of an extreme example, right? But I'm sure we can think of there are ways in which it's not that clear whether it's like disenfranchising 10% or a small minority of the chain. So maybe like
of the community, right? Because like every blockchain has like a community. It's not the chain that's disenfranchised.
So I think that
it's like some of you guys.
Wasn't the question specifically about token balances? Or
yes, no, this isn't specifically about token balance.
Okay, so I assume by 10% you literally meant 10% of the value.
Just like one example of something.
I thought we were talking about 10% of the community.
Okay.
And then I felt some assumptions about weighting by coin holdings, and I don't like that. Because like I don't think like community membership is weighted by coin holdings.
It is also the fact that I'm sorry, this is again about coin holdings, but even if you could have subtle rules that progressively disenfranchise small balances, at the end of the day, the reason that the only reason you might want to have a large balance is because there are a lot of people with small balances. So if you're not making a good system for them to use, then that's not really interesting for you. As far as I think the same goes with the users of the system. So even if you have users of the system who are even holding like very small balance because they need to participate, to act on it, or maybe they're just developing software for it, or any sort of thing like this. Overall, the interests tend to be aligned. I think the scenarios that Vlad has in mind is one where you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when you have a large chain that's become so useful that it's a monopoly, and somehow all the token holders are sitting on this and say, well, if you want to use our chain, you're going to have to pay up, and the fees are going to be high, and all this stuff. But I don't.
It's one of the scenarios.
One of the scenarios, but I think overall you're still going to have competitive pressure, and you're still mostly going to have a very strong alignment between. What people who hold tokens want to do and what people who want to use the system want to do.
Just fork.
I don't know. I doubt it. And yeah, I think forking is great, but I think it's only limited. There's only going to be some small number of like super major blockchains. I think. Like I don't really. I mean, you guys might disagree, but I don't really think that like the future of blockchains is gonna be like hyper competitive.
It's fair.
What are we talking about now?
How competitive the future of blockchain is going to be. But the thing is like if it's not hyper competitive, then by definition you have a very, very wide base of people holding the tokens anyway.
No, not necessarily. You have a wide base of users. You know, you have a parallel concentration. Okay, wide base. Okay, maybe instead of like 8 dudes, it's 80. Maybe instead of 80, it's 800. But it's not going to be like that many.
So I'm not sure how you would, you know, are we moving on to why there will be a small number of blockchains in the future, or are we sticking with governance?
So I actually
It's related because the whole
not
consent
convinced
of
it is.
opting in. Yeah, no, the argument that the consent of opting in is enough for establishing the legitimacy of the blockchain, I think, is like rests on the idea that that consent is meaningful because you have an alternative. And if it's not competitive, then you need more to establish the legitimacy of a system than just people voluntarily opting in.
Okay, so there seems to be some assumption here that firstly it needs like this nebulous concept called legitimacy, which I don't agree with at all. And secondly, that, you know, users should somehow dictate what happens on a blockchain, which I also don't agree with at all. So maybe we should cover assertions before we...
I do actually want to
Well, I mean,
cover
I'd
one
love to
last
talk
thing
about
before
that.
we move on to audience questions, which is, so like, token distributions and their effect on governance, right? So especially governance is very connected to sort of proof-of-stake networks, and most proof-of-stake networks will launch with governance inbuilt. And we did all these fundraisers, ICOs, and arguably our token distributions may not be the greatest right now. So what are some of the effects of token distributions on governance, and how does it impact?
Well, okay, so this ultimately, in my mind, it very much depends on whether you're a one head, one count, or one head, one vote, one DAP, one vote sort of a guy. Which I don't know. Maybe I'm misjudging here.
No,
but
I'm definitely not. No, I'm not into counting.
Oh, yeah, right. Indeed. Well, I prefer counting. I think counting is quite good. I think that's, we've built these great machines that count, and it's changed the world for the better in general. So I think counting is, in general, a really good thing.
I mean, if you're counted, you know, and depends how much you're counted for.
Yeah, maybe it's like not so good for people that like find it hard to get counted, but like, but you know, and I can see that. But by and large, counting is the one thing that allows us to have consensus, and I think consensus is the one thing that allows us to actually kind of stay together and
Legitimacy is enough.
Yeah, so seems to be a nebulous concept, and I'm not clear on what you mean by legitimacy.
I mean common knowledge that will go with something. I mean like the kind of like it's like a kind of distributed state of knowledge that we're gonna go with it.
Yeah, so I don't see how that can possibly be like if it's distributed, then unless there's some consensus mechanism over it, then it's going to be subjective.
I mean. Do you think rough consensus is subjective?
Yes, because it's rough and therefore it's not absolute.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It works. I think it works pretty well, and I think that it leads to enough legitimacy for example, the IETF.
So I don't know what you mean by legitimacy still, but I think
the fact
consensus,
that people will agree to go with it in like a collective way, where they're not really asking questions.
So where everyone agrees to go with it, or where some
no,
people
not everyone.
No.
No.
The people who find it legitimate aren't going to ask questions about whether each other will go with it. It's a state of knowledge that will use the system collectively.
So okay, so there's either consensus
State of knowledge that will collectively use the system.
that this decision should be made, or there's not consensus. But I don't believe in this kind of vague halfway house of like distributed,
I think consensus
rough
is-
consensus. Like
I mean, no,
that's not consensus. That just
consensus-
results in nothing happening.
Rough consensus is consensus.
Okay, so we can drop the rough then. It's just consensus that
No,
you're
so
talking
I mean,
about now.
consensus is one way. Like you can have like mechanisms that give us consensus, and consensus is one source of legitimacy. But there's others also.
Right, so I still don't understand what you mean by legitimacy.
Yeah, just like our distributed like common state of knowledge that we're going to use some shared decision-making process.
Okay, so this is a consensus now.
No, this is legitimacy.
But you've just described legitimacy as consensus, and when I ask you about consensus, you should describe it as something that's legitimate.
I think it's like So we have like roughly 15 minutes left. So I think it's a good time to move away from legitimacy versus consensus and move on to audience questions. So maybe we'll find the questions in what got upvoted. Let's start with Amir.
Yeah. You said, this is maybe to Vlad. Yeah, hello. Yeah, this is maybe to Vlad. Some people believe that there is a hard reality that is fixed, that is knowable, and that people are generally the same, and that there's very little difference, for example, between the behavior of a Chinese person or a Mediterranean person or an American person. And always in terms of technologies, there's always like a tendency, especially in these like distributed communities, towards a massive amount of fragmentation. And usually there's the way that technologies are kind of brought together into like a single technology is through some kind of standards body. And, you know, there's a process that's in there of the development of that, which is some level of compromise, some level of conflict, people doing consensus building.
Please keep your questions to like 10 seconds.
Yeah, sure.
So we can get...
But you said that you believe there's only going to be a small number of currencies. Do you not see the conflict inside your philosophy of life? If you think that there's going to be one coin, when there's like many different contexts, there might be coins which are based more on social consensus,
No, I'm not saying
hard
there's only
consensus.
a small number. I'm just talking about the distribution. There's going to be a large number, and then like a small number are going to be the most important ones. That's all I'm saying. There's a big number of them. It's just like a way more than... I mean, there's already a huge number. There's going to be more.
Actually, all right. Thank you very much. So I have a question here from Christoph. So gas can measure users, so the gas that users spend, and developers can be measured by the gas that's spent on contracts that they've deployed. What do you think about gas-based voting long term? So I guess usage-based voting.
I think there's a lot of interesting metrics on that you can take. Some of them are harder than others, and this one is a nice countable one. So I like that. Yeah. So yeah, I would say it has a place in a a potential sort of eventual governance system. I would say that ultimately decision making should be based around the network's sort of very clear, very countable stakeholders. And it should be sort of made absolutely known, sort of kind of upfront before it should be possible for people to invest or divest before that comes into effect. So either before the system begins, or if it's going to be a change from an existing governance mechanism to that governance mechanism in the period after it's been decided, but before it's been enacted. But yeah, I would generally say that these kinds of additional, more sophisticated means of measuring stake are a good ingredient.
You have to be very careful with those. Like anytime you try to do something with fees, there's always the risk that someone's going to, go behind the mechanism of the blockchain back and just like pay the miner directly. So if you want to do this, you kind of have to force a burn, but then you end up. So the idea is that people who want to use it, it will cost them less to do this burn than people who didn't want to use it in the first place, and so forth. But you introduce some friction in doing that. Like you introduce a way of people for people to try to gain a voice in governance by making transaction. I think there may be attack vectors here. I'm not entirely sure it's safe to do that.
So the other question is like, how much does a burn fee worth versus a coin vote?
Yeah.
If you're going to give both,
Yeah.
how do you count apples and oranges?
So I would say that they should probably be of different qualities. which is to say, I don't think it necessarily should have hard power associated with it, in the same way that, for example, locking a token up for 3 months after the decision has been carried would have hard power qualities. But I think it can be a very a useful signaling mechanism, and it could, for example, alter what the default is. So alter what happens when there is a lower turnout than like 100%. It could sway something. It could have like soft power.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think the signaling is super valuable, and I think actually like anything we can do so that people can signal their opinions is great. But I also think defaults are terrifyingly powerful. And so I don't know if I would set the defaults with anything. I would prefer if the user has to type in some command line flags, or when they boot up their GUI, they have to select a radio button, or like it won't run.
Yeah.
Actually,
But you're right, defaults are terrible, but and defaults are so powerful, then that's why it doesn't matter that people have to click anything, because you're a user, you run a node, and then you're like, well, everyone's moving to that hard fork, you know, it's the official hard fork. All right, I'll just upgrade because I have no interest in running a chain on that other
Which is why contentious forks are so liberating, right?
The what?
Well, contentious forks are so liberating because, like, you know, there's no, you know, like really like clear idea of what's going to happen.
I haven't seen any single contentious fork where it wasn't clear which chain was going to which one was going to dominate.
Well, there's a time that the fork is activated, and then there's like way before where people start freaking out about it. And like but definitely people are freaking out because they're not sure.
this is actually, maybe we can, like, quickly as a side question. How do you deal with voter apathy in governance, right? Like, this comes back to a question of what should the defaults be? Should there be defaults? Should everyone be forced to vote? Yeah. How do you generally deal with people not participating in governance in large numbers, and so like the minorities deciding the fate of the majority in that sense?
So I would say this makes an underlying and opaque assertion that governance should be voting based or should be democratic, and I'm not like convinced on either case yet, but I don't think forcing people to vote will give sensible results.
Usually, you make them pay for not voting. You charge them.
It's the same thing.
You charge them.
Still don't think
That's
it's
the
gonna give
crypto
sensible
economic
results.
solution. You make them pay,
So I think if you go back to the original
or maybe you pay them for voting.
if you go back to the original ideas around around Bitcoin, it was very much seen as a peer-to-peer network where, you know, people are going to have their coin, they're going to run the computer, and they'll participate in mining. And you can see this, you know, the consensus algorithm is really made for people who are going to have their computers on and off. And clearly now, like it's clear that you have this there's pretty strong distributions of users, where users are going to interact with the system some users are going to interact with the system very rarely, and some other users or participants in a network are going to be online almost constantly. And so, you know, in Bitcoin, that might be like miners versus like people who are simply holding Bitcoin. But I think the way around apathy is to do what's done in Tezos. Actually, you have some sort of delegation, so a liquid democracy type of model where you have some delegation towards someone who's probably paying closer attention to the network and is going to vote, but you give people the option of becoming, of like removing themselves from this delegation if somehow you don't force a delegation. People can go and delegate if they feel strongly about a particular issue to someone else.
So I think delegation is a kind of a band-aid. It's not necessarily a bad ingredient to the final mix, but I think it ultimately you have to make sure that the delegate doesn't suffer from apathy eventually, and B, that the delegator doesn't suffer from apathy for choosing the delegate, which is, I think, the bigger risk. There may end up just being two big delegates, and half of the people delegate to one and half the people delegate to the other, end up with like the UK with two political parties.
Or like delegations for delegates that like haven't been active for years.
Yep.
Most delegations inactive.
Let's take another question from the audience. Yes.
So actually I have a question about not thinking about different roles of stakeholders and networks. I want to ask specifically, what do you think what should be in the longer term the role of foundations in different networks? Because the way I see it is that in
Cool. So the question was, what should, roughly paraphrased, what should be the future role of foundations in these networks, given that they are, depending on the network, given large influences over the network, whether that's due to like essentially reputation or token balances as pre-mines?
Well, not a lawyer, but a foundation might be useful for some things like holding assets like trademark and money. And they might be useful for, you know, governance more broadly speaking. But I mostly understand foundations as a legal, as like a legal institution that follows the specific rules that it's mandated to follow. And so you can use the law to like constrain this institution that holds things that are like assets that are like defined and protected in the legal tradition. With rules that like, you know, you can't change, and that like, you know, when there's no owners. And so like foundations are really, really solid legal instruments relative to, say, for example, a corporation that like I own, or that someone you know owns, or that a few people own, for owning, for example, trademarks.
Actually, maybe I should rephrase my question. My question was more towards, should foundations have a way of influencing protocol upgrades in the future?
Should
In a way, it seems that undoubtedly with certain networks, the foundation of that network has huge influence in future upgrades.
So just restating the question. The question is, should the foundation have a role in software upgrades? And I mean, I think this question is harder for me to answer. I mean, I don't know. I don't imagine that the foundation is a foundation is much more than this like legal entity. I think, but it does. In like, you know, say if the case of Ethereum, it funds a lot of development and supports a lot of the people who do make code, like, you know, real governance decisions at the end of the day. But I don't know whether you interpret that as the foundation making the decisions or not. And so, so if you do, then I would think, yeah, there's probably a role. And if you don't, then I think, you know, maybe there's not a role.
I think foundations are just, they're inevitably other entities, other players in the space, and they may be, they may have an outsized level of influence because, you know, they own a load of tokens, or they have a lot of cash, a lot of employees in the within the system. But they are ultimately, they have their own level of politics, and they, you know, they shouldn't be recognized as anything other than another player with its own interests. Hopefully, given that, they will say and do sensible things, things that, you know, we would normally look to responsible leadership for. But I think, you know, as responsible paranoiacs in this lovely trust-free ecosystem, we should look to them as you know, as just another potential actor playing this game.
I'm going to echo Gavin. I think the point of on-chain governance is, one of the main points of on-chain governance is that if you're trying to have fork-based governance, people are going to try to go with forks which are canonical, and they may see some players as determining canonicity. And so it's very important for, I think it's important for the health of the ecosystems, for actors like foundations, for example, to just be one participant in the network and not try to be a canonical participants. I mean, beyond that, I think everyone should play to their strengths, and one of the strengths of foundation is doing the type of stuff foundation do, which is like funding public good, funding research. I think it's great that we are in an ecosystem where almost all of the code is open source, and almost all the research is shared, and I think it's good for the entire ecosystem.
Okay.
So I'll follow that one up with a very quick point.
Very quick.
Back in 2014, at the Ethereum Foundation, we kind of, before it was even really formed, we had a sort of semi-official pact that as soon as Ethereum was at a state where we could code a DAO, we would dismantle the Ethereum Foundation and put all its assets in a DAO and have the Ethereum community actually run it. That never happened.
And also isn't part of the charter of the foundation, and therefore can't happen. Sorry, guys.
Cool.
I don't think it's gonna happen.
I think we have to cut it here, I've been told. So thank you very much, guys, for coming on. I hope this was entertaining to everyone.